Welcome to Convict Lives Australia. Today we are diving into the incredible and at times horrifying life of Robert Abbott, a slave turned convict. Now, unfortunately, I do not have a gravesite to visit or a cemetery to explore because I do not know where Robert is buried. But I just could not pass up this opportunity to tell you all about Robert's life after I'd come across his story. Now, there is no doubt that Robert received harsher than usual treatment from his British overseers. Unfortunately, we cannot know if that was because the colour of his skin, his behaviour, or perhaps both. But this poor man endured terrible times and severe punishments during his sentence. He certainly isn't the only convict to have endured such treatment, but I wonder what role his status as a former slave played. Robert is believed to have been born into slavery in 1808 in Demerara, a region that was part of British Guiana, now Guyana. In 1832, he was convicted of possessing stolen goods and sentenced to 7 years transportation as a convict. Described as black, with black woolly hair and black eyes, Robert had a scar on his right cheekbone and another on the outer corner of his left eye, which unfortunately the ChatGPT did not give me. And he's also the tallest convict I've come across, with one record listing him as 5'9.5" inches and another as 5'10.75" inches. So he was a tall man. Robert was a Roman Catholic and he could neither read nor write. Demerara, an historical region located on the northern coast of South America, known for its sugar plantations, was originally a Dutch colony before becoming British in the early 19th century. Now here we have Robert's convict conduct record, and can you see on the bottom left there it says native place Boston. Does this mean that Robert was born in Boston in the United States and then sold to a slave owner in British Guiana? It's possible. What do you think? Anyway, Robert was transported on the ship Hercules, arriving in New South Wales on October the 16th. Now, interestingly, this is the same ship my 4 times great-grandfather Richard Thomas Clarke arrived on too. And you can watch his video, a video I did about him at the link below. And I find it fascinating that my great-great-grandfather would have known this man. The stark difference, though, in their treatment and lives is considerable. Now, upon arrival in Sydney, Robert was immediately thrown into the harsh convict labour system, assigned to a street gang, and faced multiple punishments for various offences. These included stealing a silk pocket handkerchief, for which he received 50 lashes. Absconding, he received 2 months on the treadmill, and then in December he was tried for disobedience to an order and insolence, a word often used to punish any sign of defiance. His punishment was 25 lashes and a return to the street gang. 1834 was an even tougher time for Robert. He endured a total of 210 lashes for various misdemeanours, including 2 50-lash punishments only days apart. Can you imagine the agony he suffered? The first set of 50 lashes that year was for breaking his leg irons with intent. The physical and emotional pain he must have experienced is unimaginable, highlighting the brutal conditions convicts faced during that era. Convicts assigned to street gangs often wore leg irons as a form of punishment and to prevent escape. These heavy metal shackles were fastened around the ankles and typically hot riveted on by a blacksmith, making them difficult to remove. Standard leg irons weighed around 7 pounds, which was 3.2 kilos, but heavier versions could weigh up to 14 pounds, which was 8 kilograms. When convicts were mustered and marched to work, their leg irons were often attached to a gang chain, keeping the men together and preventing any from escaping into the bush. In convict slang, leg irons were known as darbies or slangs. These irons served as a constant reminder of the convict's punishment and were often used to maintain control and discipline within the labour gangs. The other lashes that Robert received were for larceny, using threatening language and insolence, and he also received a 2-month iron punishment for the larceny. If a convict already in an iron gang received a punishment of irons, it meant that additional or heavier leg irons were applied as a further form of punishment. Sounds dreadful. This could involve fitting the convict with heavier leg irons, increasing the physical burden and discomfort, or placing them in double irons, where 2 sets of leg irons were used, making movement even more difficult. Additionally, the duration for which the convict had to wear the irons could be extended prolonging their suffering. These measures were intended to further discipline the convict and deter any further misconduct, reflecting the harsh conditions and strict control within the convict labour system. In September of 1836, Robert was assigned to a Mr. Brown, and he was accused by David Archer and William Smith of absconding, resulting in another 50 lashes. Now, this was probably the David Archer who arrived in Sydney in 1834 as a free man and went to work on his great-uncle James Walker's properties in New South Wales. Now, between 1831 and 38, David became joint superintendent with an Andrew Brown, overseeing the management and operations of these extensive properties. So therefore, Andrew Brown is likely the man Robert was assigned to, working as a convict labourer on one of the properties out near Lithgow. In 1838, Robert was put on trial at the Bathurst Quarter Sessions for possessing firearms and engaging in bushranging. Consequently, he was sentenced to life transportation to Norfolk Island. Many of Australia's first bushrangers were convicts who escaped from the harsh conditions of chain gangs or penal stations. John Black Caesar, an African convict from the First Fleet, is often considered the first bushranger, known for repeatedly escaping and surviving by stealing provisions. Perhaps Robert had heard of Caesar's exploits and was inspired to emulate his daring and rebellious spirit. Robert was placed on a hulk ship in Sydney Harbour called the Phoenix to await his transportation to Norfolk Island. Now, the Phoenix Hulk was typically moored in Lavender Bay, and here's an image, an out-of-copyright image of Lavender Bay, and it's the only one I could find, which is why it has that writing on there. So I have no idea who Eileen is, but that's where she used to live. Okay, so Lavender Bay used to actually be known as Hulk Bay due to the presence of the Phoenix. According to author Margaret Hazard, in her book Convicts and Commandants of Norfolk Island 1788 to 1855 on page 29, Governor Darling decreed that Norfolk Island should be the ultimate prison, a place of the harshest punishment short of death. This included it being an island without women or children. So in 1826, all women and children had been removed to the mainland. Many convicts would come to see death as a release from the hell of Norfolk Island in the years to come. Now, Robert arrived on the island on January 19, 1839, and he was stationed at the Longridge Agricultural Settlement. Scottish-born Commandant Alexander McConaughey was in charge. McConaughey had developed Longridge and Cascade as agricultural outstations to keep new prisoners away from the influence of the old ones. McConaughey had been horrified at the condition of the 1,200 convicts on Norfolk Island when he arrived, and he said, "I found the island a turbulent hell. The men were fed like animals and drank from water buckets, not cups." The Longridge settlement created work for convicts in tending crops that provided essential food for the island. The prison was built for McConaughey to test out his ideas for rehabilitation. As part of his rehabilitation plans, McConaughey arranged for a team of clergy to come to the island, a Protestant chaplain and 2 Roman Catholic priests, and they would sit and read to the convicts from the Bible and other Christian books. There were also 14 Jewish convicts, and McConaughey arranged a room for them to worship in. And years later, he met one of them in London, a free, happily married man, doing really well and completely reformed. According to McConaughey anyway. In evidence he gave to the Select Committee on Prison Discipline in 1850, McConaughey was asked how long he had kept men in separation, meaning how long had he kept men in isolation. And he replied that he had kept one man in isolation for 6 months and he deeply regretted it. And he said he'd become nearly helpless and was a very different man afterwards from what he was before. And one convict giving evidence for his involvement in a prison outbreak said, "Let a man's heart be what it will, and when he comes here, his man's heart is taken from him, and he is given the heart of a beast." Robert continued to receive numerous punishments on the island. His first punishment was a reprimand for being absent from the convict camp and for stealing potatoes. Author Margaret Hazard, in her book on pages 27 and 29, gives some insight into why Robert was stealing the potatoes, although it's probably not too hard to guess. She writes, "After the day's work was done, the convicts were marched back to the stockade, and inside were sleeping quarters and a kitchen with 2 great boilers into which food was thrown to be cooked. Often the men preferred to eat their salt meat raw. At least then it didn't shrink to an unrecognisable mite or get exchanged for a smaller piece belonging to another man. And they could also cook their ration of flour in the hot ashes under the boiler if they were lucky enough to get back to the stockade before the fires were too low." Apparently the island was once abundant with orange trees, but Colonel Morissette, sometime in the early 1830s, maliciously ordered them all to be cut down, except in the officers' gardens, as punishment for the convicts wasting time picking and eating them. Goodness me. A year later, he was sentenced to 3 months in the Longridge jail for using threatening language towards a policeman on duty. He managed to behave himself for another year before getting into a fight with another prisoner named Nichols, which resulted in another 2-month stint in jail. Afterwards, he was ordered to work in the gang, likely a road gang responsible for building infrastructure on the island. In 1843 and 44, things took a turn for the worse for Robert, possibly due to a new, more brutal overseer, Major Joseph Childs. Lord Stanley had directed him to be a strict disciplinarian and to allow none of the indulgences McConaughey had been known for. In April, Robert was suspected of irregularities in the ward, whatever that means, and fighting, resulting in a punishment of 4 months working in irons at Longridge and sleeping in jail until further orders. In July of the same year, Robert was convicted of gross insolence and conduct in the presence of his chain gang, exhorting them to resist their overseer. His punishment was an additional month in irons, on top of his existing 4-month sentence. Now, it's also interesting to know that overseers were often, especially in Norfolk Island, were often former convicts. So these men were brutal. And a month later, Robert was charged with using abusive language towards his overseer and received another week in irons. So he was having some real problems, probably with just a horrible person. The following month, he was again charged with using abusive language towards his overseer and received another week in irons. 2 months later, he was accused of shaking a fellow prisoner and received another month in irons. And on November the 10th, Robert was reprimanded for some behaviour that is unclear from the records. So he was really not having a good time. In June of 1844, Robert was accused of insolence and using obscene language towards the Assistant Superintendent, Mr. John Simmons. And he worked under Major Childs, so they were probably all horrible. Anyway, Robert's punishment was to work in irons for 14 days at Longridge and to sleep in jail during that period. The jail conditions must have been really harsh for this to be considered a punishment for convicts. In August, Robert was charged with malingering and insolence. Malingering refers to the act of deliberately pretending to be ill or injured, often to avoid work or responsibilities. His punishment was, of course, to wear irons, although the duration is unclear from the records. In March 1844, Robert was again accused of stealing potatoes from Mr. Simmons's garden. Interestingly, he was acquitted of this crime. A few days later, he was absent without leave and was put in irons for 14 days as punishment. In April, he was accused of being absent from the settlement and of shaking the officer who apprehended him, resulting in another 28 days in irons. A month later, again, he was accused of stealing more potatoes. He must have loved the spuds. He was probably starving, and who could blame him? Since these potatoes were the property of the Crown, he received the punishment of 3 months of hard labour in chains. In July, Robert was again absent without leave. I wonder where he disappeared to. He received 14 days of solitary confinement. On the same day, he was also charged with misconduct for having mutton in his possession. Well, maybe he was out stealing sheep, which he couldn't account for. And as punishment, he received 100 lashes. A month later, he was charged with sitting on the road on his way to work, but he was acquitted of this. Look, he was probably recovering from the 100 lashes that he'd only had a month ago? And which would probably cause anyone to need to sit and rest from time to time, which also may have been why he was acquitted. A month later again, he was charged with disobeying orders and using violent language towards a sentry in the execution of his duty, resulting in 10 days of solitary confinement. John Frederick Mortlock, a former convict, recounted his experiences in his book. He wrote that imprisonment in dark underground cells for 30 to 90 days were far more feared than the lash. And during Major Childs' time, usual punishments ranged from 50 to 300 lashes. That Major Childs was a monster. Seriously, that's just terrible. Certain crimes resulted in 2 years in the jail gang with heavy irons crossing from hand to leg. In October of 1845, the administration of Norfolk Island was transferred from New South Wales to Tasmania, and Robert, along with most of the convicts on Norfolk, were transported to Van Diemen's Land on the Lady Franklin. It was likely one of the best things to have ever happened to the convicts who got to leave Norfolk Island. The tales of the torture, punishment and misery they endured are really unbelievable, and I only touch on them in this biography. I've tried not to get distracted, but it is hard. Now, Robert arrived in Hobart on March the 19th, 1846, and he was sent to Impression Bay, or the Impression Bay Convict Outstation. By July, he had been assigned to a working gang at nearby Wedge Bay for a probation period of 1 year. And in December, he was charged again with misconduct for mistreating a watchman while on duty, and he received 4 days in solitary confinement. A week later, he was charged with insolence towards his master and received another 7 days in solitary confinement. In May, he was absent without leave again and received another 7 days in solitary. One wonders if by now Robert preferred lashes to solitary confinement. What a truly miserable existence he was living. By November, he had been granted a PPH, which was a probation pass, which was a designation in the probation system indicating a convict who had been granted certain freedoms and responsibilities while still under supervision, so that's positive. In November in 1847, Robert was charged with stealing £5 and sentenced to hard labour and chains. In 1848, Robert was moved to Launceston, where he was assigned to work for John Hollowell on Bathurst Street. Notably, he was paid the least amount of wages at 3 shillings, while most of the men earned around 9. He must have been staying at the prisoner barracks at night because in June he was accused of concealing a blanket on his person to carry it out of the barracks. Well, no wonder, it was June in Tasmania, it would have been freezing. For this misdemeanour, he received 4 months of hard labour in irons. In 1849, Robert was assigned to work for Samuel Gunn in Park Street in Launceston. Interestingly, he was paid the same as all the other men, and even more than a couple of them, at 9 shillings. Was this because he had proved his worth as a worker? Or did Mr. Gunn treat all men as equals? Interesting. His only misdemeanour that year was 10 days of solitary confinement for being out after hours. And can you see what a difference being treated equally makes? Robert was assigned to work for 2 more men in Launceston that year, a Mr. Robert Gould and a John R. Bateman. And remarkably, he was paid the same as and even more than some of the other convicts at over 12 shillings. There were no more misdemeanours, which I just love that. Had Robert found some sort of peace in Launceston, or was it because he had met a young lady, a fellow convict named Elizabeth Hallam? Perhaps it was a combination of being treated fairly and the prospect of a wife that brought stability to his life. And in April 1850, Robert received his ticket of leave, and a year later, on July the 8th, 1851, he married Elizabeth at St. Joseph's Catholic Church in Launceston, with Reverend Thomas Butler officiating the ceremony. Now, Elizabeth has her own wild story, and she'll be the subject of my next video, so watch out for that in the coming weeks. At the time of their marriage, Elizabeth was still in the House of Correction in Launceston. There is a note on Robert's conduct record that appears to indicate he petitioned for his wife to receive a ticket of freedom, but it was refused. The writing is really quite hard to decipher, but I believe that is what it says. Robert was a skilled cooper, which meant he was a maker and repairer of casks and barrels. Now, I'm not sure how much of that work he did on assignment, but in November of 1852, he was working for a man named Mackenzie in Launceston, and things did not seem to be going very well. Robert was charged with behaving in a riotous and disorderly manner, and he received 6 months imprisonment and hard labour at the prison barracks. And I wonder, was that to do with his wages? Had Mackenzie paid him less or treated him less than the others? Unfortunately, we will never know, but things seem to go downhill from this point on in time. In 1853, Robert's movements can be tracked through his numerous misdemeanours. In May, he was charged with misconduct towards an unknown individual, but no punishment was recorded. In July, Robert possibly breached his servant or employment contract, resulting in a month in prison. The following month, he received another month in prison with hard labour for misrepresenting himself as a free man. But good news! By 1855, Robert was assigned to work for Alexander Clarke in Longford in Tasmania, and by April, he'd received a conditional pardon. A conditional pardon could be recommended by the Lieutenant Governor to the Crown for a convict. This pardon specified the convict's permitted and restricted actions, often limiting their movement to the colony only. Now, in 1858, it's interesting to note that Robert's wife Elizabeth was jailed for 18 months for a serious crime, which I will discuss in my next video. At her trial, she went by the name Elizabeth Hallam, and I wonder why this was. Were Robert and Elizabeth no longer living together or married? I don't know. There are no records of the couple producing any children either. But these were two individuals that were highly traumatised, so I can imagine the issues that they both had in their marriage. Well, actually, I probably can't. In February 1863, a notice was put in the February 6th edition of Reports of Crime in Tasmania. Again, there is no mention that Robert was accompanied by a wife. So he's obviously been working, he's received his cheque, and someone has stolen them from him. Gosh, can this man get a break? And now information from here does become sketchy. In 1878, the next record I can find, at the age of 70, Robert is admitted into the Brickfields Invalid Asylum in Hobart. The Brickfields Invalid Depot had opened in 1859 to provide indoor relief for the aged and destitute in Hobart. Now, these institutes were a necessity because most of these convicts had been banished from their homelands, never able to return. They had no family and no one to take care of them. So what was going to become of them? Now, apparently this one couldn't meet the high demand, leading to the opening of the Launceston Invalid Depot for men in 1868, with women being housed in part of the jail. I'd assume the people who dreamt up the convict scheme hadn't thought that these people were going to age, I'm not sure. And other institutions like the Cascades Invalid Depot and the Newtown Charitable Institution were also used to accommodate the aged. By 1879, the colony had 897 invalids. This caused overcrowding, with many forced to sleep on the floor. Daily routines were monotonous, privacy was non-existent, and married couples were separated. Robert was discharged from the Brickfields on the 21st of December by order of the Administrator of Charitable Grants, as he was deemed able to work despite his age. Another report indicates that he was discharged from the depot on the 7th of January in 1879, again with the administrator's approval. On the 15th of April 1879, he was admitted to the Newtown Charitable Institute and discharged on the 5th of August at his own request. In 1880, he was admitted to the Launceston Invalid System, also known as the Invalid Depot, which was established in 1868 by converting the old military barracks in what is now Royal Park. It mainly housed destitute male emancipates with chronic medical conditions. Robert was discharged at his own request on the 10th of January 1881. Listed as unable to work, he was 73 years old. This is the last record I can find on Robert Abbott. There is one death record that could fit in 1885, but that Robert Abbott was living in Hobart and his occupation was listed as a master mariner, so I don't believe that is our Robert. I believe he is probably buried somewhere in Launceston, probably at the General Cemetery, also known as the Cypress Street Cemetery. This cemetery was used for many years and included sections for paupers and those without means. But if anyone has any further details about where Robert might be buried or is buried, please let me know in the comments. I cannot even imagine the indignities and hardships that Robert suffered during his life. As a slave and a convict, he would have endured unimaginable challenges and injustices. Yet we remember him as part of our extraordinary Australian convict history, a testament to the resilience and strength of those who helped shape our nation.